first, I would like to start by saying that every time a Spider-Man movie comes out, I get really excited. Very rarely has, the Spider-Man movies had a miss. It's just that the character, the web slinging, the stories, and its villains all combined make Spider-Man that great of a character, to be honest. I think that's really, what it is. Now, as for this movie, I have to say that it took the plot and its visuals to the next level compared to its predecessor. First of all, the predecessor itself, was a whole another experience. Now this movie was even bigger. Let's first start with Miles Morales' character. I was honestly happy to see him, fully embrace himself as Spider-Man. On top of that, I was also happy to see him, preparing for college and his parents' involvement in his life. It kind of, reminded me of my high school life, which is also one of the reasons why, Spider-Man hits home that much. He's one of those kind of characters, if not only characters, who really hits home. So there's that. And then that scene was also quite a memorable scene, where he was with his parents in front of the counselor or principal, cannot really remember. But then, for a while, he was there. Then again, then he had to dress up as Spider-Man to stop the villain Spot, and then come back again after he webs up Spot for a while, and then he sees Spot off the leash. So then he has to again like go and back and stop Spot. So that entire sequence was a hilarious yet an awesome sequence. It sure did bring a strong hook to the movie, and that way I was quite hooked to watch the movie. Brings me to Spot. Now, I do have to say, on the surface, he seemed like a very, goofy villain, but then his abilities were on a different level. And I also have to say that, good thing about Spot was that, regardless of the kind of villain he was, I mean, first of all, I do have to say that he looked like a kind of villain, who was just going to be, a random villain Miles has to deal with just for the opening scene of the movie. But then seems like, he turned out to be Miles' arch-nemesis, and he's also going to have to fight him in the next movie. So there's that. I think one thing I liked about that idea was the fact that Miles is now, truly his own Spider-Man, and he's fighting his own villains, which gives importance to his version of Spider-Man. And that way, he's not fighting Peter Parker's villains as Spider-Man. So that way, he truly gave importance to Miles's version of Spider-Man as well. My first time seeing the hero and the villain create each other at different points of time in the prequel, because Spot actually created a spider that bit Miles Morales, and then Miles shut off the collider in the first movie that also created Spot and gave him the abilities he had in this movie. Now hear me out, I have to bring this up, but just hear me out. I'm gonna tell you why I changed my mind afterwards. That was, for a while I actually felt like this was never really part of the plan. They only came up with this idea after seeing the success of the previous movie, and then only they thought of coming with this idea and using it for creating a sequel, which was this movie. So that way it was never pre-planned. However, I was later on able to overcome that idea, because then I realized that the spider that came from the alternate universe that bit Miles Morales, that we know as Spider-Man, was supposed to bite the Miles Morales from that universe, who turned out to become the Prowler instead, under the influence of his uncle, given that the spider did not bite him, even though the spider was supposed to bite him and he was supposed to become Spider-Man. On top of that, Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099, says how Miles Morales was never supposed to be Spider-Man. Instead, he was an anomaly for that reason. And that way, I liked how things came together, and I was late. That way, I was also able to overcome that idea of how they never really they only came up with this idea after seeing the success of the prequel, and had to come up with an idea to make the sequel. And I will also say that I'm glad actually they went with this idea to make this movie, and I'm also glad that they actually made this movie rather than stopping with the prequel, because first of all, I myself enjoyed the movie. On top of that, I'm also looking forward to the sequel of this movie as well, given how they left this movie with an intriguing cliffhanger. I wanted to touch upon Spider Gwen's character, given how she was introduced in the previous movie, but they never really dived into her backstory. However, this movie did that, so it was good to see. It was just interesting to see how she was Spider-Man in her universe, but then her father, Captain Stacy, was a police officer who was completely against Spider-Man, without knowing that she's actually his daughter. And even though he finds out that she is his daughter, he still was willing to arrest her, which was just came to show how committed he was to arresting Spider-Man, even though she was his daughter. So That was, just interesting to see that relationship of him disliking Spider-Man, even though Spider-Man's alter ego is actually his daughter. Now, it was really satisfying to see how they both, got back together towards the ending of the movie, given that Captain Stacy quit the police force, and that way he didn't have to be captain anymore, hence wasn't going to get murdered anymore. And for that reason, Gwen Stacy was also happy that he did, because that way she doesn't have to worry about him getting killed. On top of that, because Captain Stacy quit the police force, he couldn't arrest his daughter anymore, and that way they satisfyingly got back together. And now Gwen Stacy could, like peacefully, like she sure did have a peace of mind whilst, trying to save his friend's father. That was, Miles Morales. So it felt, good to see that happen. This was obviously the elephant in the room, which was the Spider-Verse itself. This one, blew everyone's mind away. Given the Spider-Man from Moonbatten and then the Spider-Punk, it came to show how creative they got with the different kinds of Spider-Man by combining them with different cultures from different places and times. As for a universe full of Spider-Man, I was honestly out of words to describe it when I saw it in the movie. I mean, like the no, references they made is like it seemed as if, like they hardly had any miss, even though they may have had a miss. It's just hard to say like if they even had any miss, just given how full of references it had, including a dinosaur version of a Spider-Man and even a cat version of Spider-Man. They just really went full on with this, which made it really hard to say if they even had any miss. This scene was truly a scene that got me thinking. The idea of having a tree of events where Miles becoming Spider-Man was never supposed to happen. Hence, he was an anomaly. Was really a next level idea to implement. This just came to show how much this like this entire franchise got bigger, or this universe as a whole is much bigger than it was in the previous movie. On top of that, the idea of Miles' father dying as a captain is supposed to happen in order for like the universe to continue the way it should without any intervention whatsoever was honestly an insane idea as well. The real question I had was why exactly was he supposed to die, and what's wrong with Miles wanting to change it, because anyone in his place should have the right to change it, which was why I was glad to see him fight Miguel for it. Speaking of which, that action scene was honestly dope. The scene, where Miguel and Miles were fighting on that train was so visually stunning to watch. That honestly reminded me of that scene from No Way Home where Spider-Man and Doctor Strange were also fighting each other on a train. After like Spider-Man stole that box from Doctor Strange, which he wouldn't allow him to do, and that scene also like also got me thinking of how good of a guy Miguel actually is, or whether he just does everything like that suits him and the timeline as well. And that scene also really hit me deep, where Miguel tells Miles that he was never meant to be Spider-Man. And on top of that, it also came to show the other Spider-Man were never really on Miles' side, but were actually working for Miguel until like push came to shove, where they actually had to help their friend Miles. Speaking of which, this was truly when the original Spider-Man team from the prequel had teamed up to, help their friend Miles. Instead of following the rules under Miguel, they decided to go out of their way to, help their friend. And this way, they set up the sequel very well. On top of that, I'm looking forward to see how Miles deals with the Miles who was supposed to become the Spider-Man instead of him. And that way also, once again, this movie truly, set up its sequel very well. And hence, I'm looking forward to its sequel. To wrap this movie, I have to ask how good was this movie compared to its predecessor? Honestly, I have to say both these movies were great in their own ways. It was amazing to see the technology used to create both these movies. Now, I will say that this movie did use aspects of its prequel to, create a story for this movie. And it just might have been that, after seeing the success of the prequel, they decided to, like make this movie, and that will like split this movie into two parts. And that's also completely fine, but what really matters is if they can still tell a good story or not. And given how next level the characters and ideas implemented in this movie were, I have to say that it was a great idea that they continue to this franchise, and hopefully the sequel of this movie is as good as both these movies, if not better.